In the last lecture, we talked about the Gilded Age, and what we found was wealth in America during this period in U.S. history, the late 19th century, was starkly divided between the rich and poor. The rich owning, the top 1% owning more than 3/4 of all wealth, the top 10% controlling 90% of the nation's wealth. And as a result, we saw the conditions this created with the tenements. We saw the cities that were being filled with dirt and grime, that were being controlled by a corrupt city government. All of these things were piling on top one of another, and the workers finally decided that they would no longer accept these conditions. And this is the flip side of the coin that we're going to be discussing in this class today, because what we see is a war against inequality being waged by these workers. But what I want to talk about beyond just the specific strikes and what you're going to have to do in the documents for this week's set of readings is also understand the different perspectives that are being put out there by these different groups of workers, because not all of them favor the same strategy in how to achieve equality among all the different workers. So that's the one thing I want you to pay attention to, and what we'll see a lot in this lecture as we talk about both the working class, the urban working class, the industrial workers, but also the rural working class, the farmers, what they feel is the best approach to solving the nation's vast inequality in the economic realm. I want to start this lecture by talking about the industrial workers, those who are working primarily at this time on the railroads as the major economic factor in American life. But what we're going to see here is, even though strikes begin to be a more common thing during the 1870s and 1880s, they don't move many things forward. And the reason they don't is because they don't have an organizational mechanism to further their causes. So eventually what we're going to see is the increasing calls for some sort of labor organization, which we'll get into on the next slide. But I want to begin here in the late 19th century. During this period, if you were a worker, you were forced to labor for 60 hours a week, with annual wages that often fell below the poverty line, and you did so working in dangerous conditions. Moreover, due to the low wages, families often had to send their children and their wives into the factories. The number of women working for wages outside of the home tripled between 1870 and 1900, so that as a result, 5 million women held full-time jobs in 1900. This represented 17% of all women. In short, by 1900, 17% of all women were working at full-time jobs outside of the home. This is a far cry from the common image of women always being a housewife, always doing domestic duties. Well, here we are in 1900, where nearly a fifth of all women are working outside of the home. Also by 1900, we find that the United States had 2 million child laborers. And keep in mind, these women and these children are working these same long hours. They're working these same terrible conditions as the male laborers. So this is not something that is easy for them to do. Well, what I want to do now is I want to turn to some of these responses to these terrible conditions facing the workers. And we're going to begin actually telling our story in 1873 that will lead to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Because what we have in 1873 is one of the most catastrophic depressions, economic depressions, that the nation has faced in its history. And as a result of this, major railroad companies in the East began to cut the wages of their workers several times, with the final one being a 10% cut in 1877. Well, in response to this latest cut, railroad workers across the country walked off the job and prevented freight trains from moving through. Violence and property destruction followed suit very quickly. In Pittsburgh, just to give you one example, railroad workers burned 39 buildings and destroyed 1,000 railroad cars and locomotives. The local militia eventually showed up, but in the process of quelling this rebellion, killed 26 protesters. In addition to these state militias, more than 3,000 U.S. Army soldiers were also involved in suppressing the strike. Well, by the end of the strike, which lasted about 6 weeks, almost 100 persons were killed, and there was about $40 million worth of property damage. Despite the lack of success of the strike, workers were encouraged to carry out more strikes, and we can see this by the numbers on the screen. According to a report by the U.S. Commissioner of Labor, in the 7 years after the 1877 strike, there were more than 450 strikes involving more than 100,000 workers annually. So these more than 450 strikes of 100,000 workers were occurring every single year. In 1886 alone, there were over 1,400 strikes involving more than 400,000 workers. We see during this period a backlash. The workers are finally saying enough is enough. But despite having all these strikes, the conditions and benefits received by the workforce are not improving. Therefore, they start to look for a different mechanism in addition to the strikes that will help them achieve better wages, better working conditions, better benefits of whatever sort. And this will lead to efforts at organization and unionization, as we'll see in the next slide. The Knights of Labor was formed as a secret society in the late 1860s by garment workers in Philadelphia. About a decade or so later, in 1879, the Knights held its first national convention, where Terence Powderly was elected president. The Knights allowed both skilled and unskilled workers, as well as women and African Americans, to join. In this regard, as we'll see, especially in comparison to the American Federation of Labor discussed in the next slide, the Knights of Labor was all-encompassing. It allowed, as you can see, a variety of people in terms of types of jobs, as well as their gender and race, to join the Knights of Labor. The only professions not allowed were bankers, lawyers, and liquor dealers. Nor, however, were Chinese immigrants welcomed. And this gets back to the growing opposition among workers to the increasing numbers of Chinese immigrants who it is believed during this time were competing against the white workers, and that led to the opposition and eventually the Chinese Exclusion Acts of the late 19th century. In terms of tactics, the Knights opposed the use of strikes. They much preferred that the federal government create a labor department to arbitrate disputes between workers and employers. This arbitration was believed to actually lead to greater change than the strikes. And in fact, there was some merit in this mindset, given what we just talked about in the prior slide, where you have hundreds, if not thousands, of strikes going on, with the belief that those strikes are not bringing material benefits to the workers. So what we see is by the mid-1880s, membership for the Knights of Labor reached 730,000. However, the Knights' fortunes fell as a result of the Haymarket Affair. What was it about this event down in Chicago, Illinois, that led to this drastic turnaround for the Knights of Labor? Well, on May 4th, 1886, 3,000 people attended a protest for the 8-hour workday. And in fact, that's what the Knights of Labor were most known for during their existence, these 8-hour workday campaigns. So here there was this major event down in Chicago at Haymarket Square. And what they were doing was they were protesting, they were giving speeches, but late in the day a bomb exploded, which was eventually followed by gunfire. As a consequence of these actions, 7 police were killed and at least 5 workers died as well. Dozens of others were also hurt. The Knights were tarred as a result of this massacre at the Haymarket Square down in Chicago. The Knights were tarred as the instigators of violence. They were deemed anarchist, and their whole organization, therefore, was tremendously affected by this image of troublemakers. And this would lead to a massive movement out and away from that organization to another organization that we'll talk about again in the next slide, the American Federation of Labor. So here we see this effort by the federal government to already, here in the 1880s, tar these labor organizations as un-American and dangerous. And we can see Terence Powderly saying here in this quote on the screen, "At every step, we are handicapped by the unwarrantable and impertinent interference of these blatant, shallow-pated men." Now here he himself, this labor leader of the Knights of Labor, is basically going with the government and saying that the trade unions need to get away from these anarchists, from these individuals seeking to use violence to further the cause of labor. And he's not the only one, even though he might be the most surprising given that he himself was a labor leader. But here you see Thomas Nast again. We've looked at his political cartoons in the past. This one comes from February 27, 1886, so even before the Haymarket Massacre. And if you'll notice here, what we see is a figure on the left who is representative of the labor movement, almost kind of a devilish-like figure here. And he is holding a flag. If you can see, it says bloody red flag. And this connotation of red during this time stands for communism and socialism. And what we see in the back here, in fact, is this sign at supposedly a labor meeting down in Chicago. "Let us do as they did in London by order of the socialists." So this idea of destruction causing mass chaos. But the difference is in the United States, this country will not stand for it. As you see the figure, the policeman with a bat that says the U.S., and beneath this political cartoon, advice to so-called American socialists, you had better not attack this club. So the idea is, again, early on, this effort to label these labor unions as foreign, subversive, dangerous, socialist. And this will lead to then the next union that we talk about, the American Federation of Labor, as you'll definitely see in the Samuel Gompers document, where he tries to distinguish his organization, the American Federation of Labor, from these more socialist and communist labor unions like the Knights of Labor. On this slide, as you can see, we will be talking about Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Labor. We will consider him the reformer. Now we're going to be comparing him to a more radical labor activist, and that is a man that we see on the left-hand bottom side of this screen, and that is Eugene Debs. So let's talk here about the reformer versus the radical. With the Knights weakened due to being labeled anarchist and socialist as a consequence of the events down at Haymarket Square in 1886, we see the American Federation of Labor, which formed that same year in 1886 under the leadership of Samuel Gompers, becoming the new leading player in the union movement. Now, Samuel Gompers was a cigar maker, and he would not only found the American Federation of Labor, he would actually lead it until his death in 1924. Rather than a single union, the American Federation of Labor was a federation of unions. Now here's the important thing. Whereas the Knights of Labor was all-inclusive, allowing women, African Americans, and both skilled and unskilled workers, the American Federation of Labor was not. And it had a lot to do with, again, Samuel Gompers. Being a cigar maker, cigar making was considered a skilled trade, and they took much pride in their process and in their trade. So therefore, being that he took such pride in being a cigar maker, he wanted to limit the American Federation of Labor to a membership that was primarily involved in the skilled trades. Moreover, to show the conservatism of the AFL, the AFL accepted the fact that the large-scale, corporate-dominated political economy, meaning capitalism, would never be overturned. So therefore, rather than seeking its destruction, as the communists and socialists did, the American Federation of Labor simply wanted a place for unions in the economic system to obtain basically a larger piece of the economic pie for workers. Thus, what we see during this time for the American Federation of Labor, they were simply interested in, as their logo said, pure and simple trade unionism. Pure and simple trade unionism, meaning they would not get involved in political matters. They were simply interested in increasing the paychecks received by the skilled tradesmen associated with the American Federation of Labor. And this worked. By 1900, the American Federation of Labor had attracted 500,000 skilled workers. This number would grow to 2 million by 1920. So clearly, this more conservative approach by Gompers led to skyrocketing membership for the American Federation of Labor. Well, not everyone agreed with this status quo conservative approach. And one of the leading individuals offering an alternative view for American workers was again the man that we see on the bottom of the screen, Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs came to prominence following the 1894 Pullman strike. So I want to talk a little bit about this strike and understand how it led to his rise as a socialist agitator for American workers. In 1894, the Pullman Company, which produced sleeping cars, cut the wages of its employees. These employees, moreover, were required to live in a company town. However, while the Pullman cut the wages of workers, he did not reduce rents or lower food prices. As a result of these events, many railroad workers joined the American Railway Union. The American Railway Union, which was founded in 1892 by that character, Eugene Debs. Now here's the thing. Debs was actually a quite conservative character early on. He actually cautioned his workers who were involved in the American Railway Union against going on strike. But nonetheless, the membership supported a strike. Therefore, 125,000 would take part in this strike of 1894, the Pullman strike, and in the process closed down 2/3 of the nation's railroads. When the strike breakers were eventually brought in to replace these striking workers, those workers who were striking attacked them, which therefore would lead to President Grover Cleveland sending in 2,000 federal troops to shut down these strikers and silence them. Following an injunction by the federal government, issued by the federal government, the strike ended. Debs, however, at the same time, was accused of violating the injunction and therefore stopping international commerce and stopping the U.S. mails. And in violation of these matters, he was sent to jail for 6 months in 1895. And it was during this time in jail in 1895 that Eugene Debs would become a socialist. And he would lead that effort to move beyond the pure and simple trade unionism favored by Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Labor, as you'll see in the document, where he talks about workers needing to, the key phrase in this document, take over the means of control from the capitalists. And you'll see more about that in the document. So what I want to do before we move on to the next slide and start talking about the revolt of the workers, I want to spend a little time on why the efforts to build permanent unions among industrial workers ultimately failed. 2 reasons I want to point out here. 2 reasons why the efforts to build permanent unions among railroad workers and other industrial workers ultimately failed. First of all, employer hostility. Employer hostility. Employers form groups like the National Association of Manufacturers. The National Association of Manufacturers propagandized against unions. They operated as an open shop, meaning that they would not recognize unions. And we also see they would blacklist previous employees who were involved with unions. So therefore, this National Association of Manufacturers would play a leading role in fighting unions by, again, encouraging the operation of these open shops, blacklisting previous employees who were involved with unions, and various other tactics and methods. Secondly, these efforts to build permanent unions failed because of a lack of government support for collective bargaining. Federal and state governments issued injunctions or court orders that forced striking workers to return to the job. So therefore, from 1880 until 1930, the courts issued over 4,300 injunctions meant to force workers to end the strike and go back to their factories or go back to the railroads and work. This would be the key thing preventing workers from having the power to use their unions to force the employers to meet them at the table and negotiate. Now, I just want to highlight and kind of give you a hint of what we're going to talk about later on, because this will change in the 1930s. In the 1930s, we're going to talk about something known as the Wagner Act. And for the first time in the history of the United States, in 1935, with the Wagner Act, the U.S. government will finally recognize American unions and their right to collectively bargain with their employers. So this will be a huge change, but that's a long time away, several decades away. Up until this point, employers do not have to recognize unions, so therefore they can easily ignore them and their demands. I want to now turn to the plight of the farmers, because what we see during this time is a group of workers who, if you remember when we were talking about westward expansion, are facing extreme hardship during this time. And one of the things that they are experiencing is not even just economic problems, but also isolation. They are out there in the middle of nowhere. They don't have constant contact with other farmers like you would in a railroad yard or an industrial factory. So their experiences are a little different. We're going to begin the story here with this Grange movement, and the movement that this Grange originated in actually started in Washington, D.C. And I want to begin this story by talking about these farmers who were forced to pay higher railroad rates to ship their crops to the market. Think about this. If you are a farmer, you are looking at the repeated payments that you have to make to these railroad companies. But meanwhile, if you remember back when we were talking about the Gilded Age, you see people like Carnegie and Rockefeller who are actually getting rebates, refunds to ship their items far cheaper, even though these robber barons had tons and tons of dollars to support the shipping. So that's the first thing and the first reason why we see farmers angry during this time. But furthermore, farmers are also receiving no support from the government. So therefore, due largely to these two issues, government bureaucrats working at the Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. formed the Patrons of Husbandry in 1867. This was more commonly known as the Grange. Over 1.5 million farmers joined the Grange by 1874. Iowa alone had 1,800 Granges. Besides serving as a fraternal society, organizing social events for isolated farmers, the Grange also fought for what it called the class interest of farmers. It did this through passage of so-called Granger laws related to those railroad rates that I mentioned earlier, and also grain elevator rates. What does this mean? Well, the Grange attempted to increase the price farmers received for grain by forming a cooperative that stored grain until the market price rose. This is all in an effort to basically ensure that the farmers can stay above water and not go into serious debt and eventually face farming foreclosures. By 1877, however, the Grange would disappear, only to be replaced very soon after by the Farmers Alliance in 1881. By 1890, the Farmers Alliance had a membership that was very comparable to that of the Grange, 1.2 million farmers. So what would the Alliance do to help and support the farmers? The Alliance gained the backing of many farmers for its sub-treasury plan. In partnership with the U.S. Treasury Department, thousands of warehouses would be built for farmers to store their crops until the prices rose, and in the meantime, the farmers would receive low-interest federal loans. So this is very similar to what we've seen again the Grange doing, but instead of just storing these crops in these cooperative mills, in these cooperative grain elevators, they would also provide these low-interest loans to the farmers. Here's the thing. This was very popular to the farmers, but Congress did not consider the plan feasible, so therefore when the plan was introduced in Congress in 1890, it was buried in committee. So here we have these efforts. with first the Grange and then the Farmers Alliance, this effort to push up the fortunes of the farmer, but they could not get political support. So therefore, if they could not get this political support, perhaps a lot of these farmers thought, we need to enter the political arena. And that is what happens in February of 1892. In February of that year, several Reform and Union officials met in St. Louis, Missouri, and founded the People's Party. In July of that same year, so July of 1892, in Omaha, Nebraska, the People's Party held a convention where they nominated James B. Weaver to run for president. Weaver received just 1 million votes, 9% of the total in the 1892 election. And this is a very common theme we're going to see throughout U.S. history, the difficulty faced by these so-called third-party candidates who are outside of the main Democratic and Republican parties. But I do want to caution you against seeing this 1892 as a complete failure for the populists, because what the populists were able to do that year was elect several senators to the U.S. Congress, 44 congressmen to the House of Representatives, 4 state governors, and they also controlled 7 state representatives. Increasingly, many Democrats, especially after the Panic of 1893, also began to work with these populists. What we're eventually going to see, therefore, and this will culminate in 1896 election, is the coming together of the Democrats and the Populist Party. I want to end this lecture then with that event. And it also, as you can see being foreshadowed here at the top of this slide, it also represented the death of populism. As populism became subsumed under the mantle of the Democratic Party, it lost its steam, and therefore it essentially would disappear, only to be replaced, as we'll talk about next week, with the progressive movement in the early 20th century. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, because I want to begin here in 1893, that economic crisis that I alluded to in the last slide. In 1893, the nation faced its worst economic depression in its history, resulting in massive farm foreclosures. In fact, in Kansas alone, between 1890 and 1894, 11,000 farmers lost their farms. With the economy growing worse, President Grover Cleveland convinced Congress to return the nation to the gold standard. And this only made matters worse. So thus a debate arose over whether America's monetary system should be backed by silver or gold. Now I want to talk a little bit about this debate between silver and gold, because this question and this issue will dominate the 1896 presidential election between William Jennings Bryan, who serves as the candidate for the Populists and the Democrats, and William McKinley, who is the Republican presidential candidate. Now, as you can see on the screen, the Populists and the Democrats supported silver. Why? Silver during this time was more plentiful. Now, up until the present, when you look in your wallet or in your purse or wherever, and you pay for something, you usually pay with paper currency. Now, that paper currency in and of itself is worthless. The only reason it has value is because those paper dollars in your purse or wallet are backed up by specie in the federal treasury, meaning some sort of either gold or silver. Now, during the late 1890s, silver was more plentiful, so therefore more dollars could be produced. But here's the thing, and this is a very basic economic lesson. I'm no economic historian or expert in economics, so this is a very basic idea here. But if you have more silver in supply, you can then release more dollar currency. Now, as there's more dollar currency in circulation, that will lead then to inflation. So why would the farmers support inflation? The idea is because the farmers are in debt. They are taking out loans to pay for their farms, the land, the equipment, so on and so forth. This will actually make it cheaper for them to pay back these debts because this inflationary silver. The advocates of gold, like the Republicans and William McKinley, on the other hand, are primarily bankers and financiers, so therefore they are worried that this will hurt their pocketbooks, and therefore they want gold to be the primary currency, specie backing up the paper currency in circulation. You see a lot of this in the document that you'll read, the William Jennings Bryan, do not crucify us, meaning the farmers, the downtrodden. In fact, that's what I want you to look for in that document. Who was William Jennings Bryan speaking for? It was the farmers and the downtrodden, but who did these represent and who were they opposed to? But nonetheless, he was speaking for these people. In the end, it was William McKinley and the Republicans who won. And again, this would represent the death of populism as it became subsumed under the label and umbrella of the Democratic Party.